Good afternoon for those that have joined us. We're just going to wait another few minutes and then we'll get things going.
Nice picture of downtown Milton.
Nice haircut, Louis. Your hair is almost as long as mine.
It's getting there, Lisa, and it's just as white, I think. See, Scott remembers me when I was a much younger man.
Yes, I do.
What was that, a year ago before COVID, Louis?
No. It's a number of years back now, more than a dozen.
I was going to say 12 to 15 years. So.
Yeah.
So I think we'll get things underway. We've got most people that have joined us, and the people that haven't logged in yet can just join us in progress. So I'm Scott McCammon, President and CEO of the Milton Chamber, and we're very fortunate to have Louis and Lisa joining us today to talk about the discoverability and AODA. And the Milton Chamber has been very fortunate to work very closely with the Ontario Chamber and with Louis and Lisa on various programs, including the discoverability. And so I won't take too long to do formal introductions. We'll just dive right into the program. So Louis, I assume I throw it to you.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to do most of the talking, I'm told. Lisa will jump in when I omit something or forget something, which I tend to do from time to time. And she's also going to move the slides forward because I'm technologically challenged and we don't want to mess this up. So you have the two today. So folks, thank you for, first of all, Scott, thank you for having us. And folks, we can do a couple of things here as I'm going through. If you do have a question as I'm going through a slide, I think, Lisa, maybe if people can ask their question through the chat, and then you can just kind of stop me and we'll try and answer the question as we go. And then if there's any additional questions at the end, we're happy to take those questions too. Okay, that would be the format that we use.
Perfect.
So just flip to the next slide if you don't mind, Lisa. Okay, so really what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about the Discoverability Network. We'll also talk about a little bit about the AODA, but just recognizing that if we were to do like a full AODA, probably every one of those subject matters that you're going to see on slides that come up later, they in themselves are a full presentation. So I'm going to kind of give you the abridged version and information there. But if you require more information, please, like I said, ask the question and we'll try and give you that information as we go. So what is Discoverability? Discoverability Network and the Milton Chamber is a partner of ours in this program. And it really is a job matching platform that helps businesses connect to talent. And it helps business connect to a very specific talent, and that's persons with disabilities. So job seekers with disabilities, they come into the platform, they put in their resumes, and then businesses on the other side of the platform, we call it the demand side of the platform, they put in their jobs, and then the algorithms in the matching platform, it's like a dating service. They will match the job ad to the individual looking for work. Then that job ad is pushed to the individual. The individual then decides whether they wish to apply for the job. And that's how the connections are made through the platform. The other big feature of the Discoverability Network is the training. And a key word there is free. It's free training. And so what do we train on? We train on the AODA. We train on inclusivity. We train on disclosure. We train on accommodations. We train on breaking down barriers in the workplace as just few of the topics that we will train on. And Lisa is our master trainer, if I could say this. Lisa has developed all those subject matters and created some great decks around them. And I have to tell you, her training is sought out by many organizations across the province. So if you think your own organization wants to get that in-depth training from Lisa, please connect with Scott, and Lisa would be happy to do that. If you're smaller organizations and you wish to do them collectively, which would be great. So if we could get 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 smaller organizations that want the training, then Lisa's happy to do that too. When she does individual company training, she's training companies like the CBC, Bell Technical, TELUS, RBC, a lot of the financial institutions. Who else, Lisa? Who else have you trained recently?
Soft Choice, Fixed Software, Pfizer's coming up, DSV is coming up.
Yeah, we're doing something with Microsoft. Who's the company that you trained where we trained their managers worldwide? Who was that?
KPMG.
KPMG. So you can see it's some pretty good training when we got those kinds of companies coming to us asking for the training. So, if you think it's something for you or your staff or a collective of businesses, just work with Scott and we're happy to bring that training directly to you as well. The other feature of the Discoverability Network is the networking, interestingly enough. And that's where, again, we try and make those connections. Now, they're all virtual, obviously, because we're not doing anything in person anymore, but they're all virtual. And we're trying to make those connections with job seekers and businesses so we can build what we call disability confidence. not only in the businesses, because there's a certain, I guess, way you talk about disabilities. There's certain do's and don'ts when you're talking about hiring from the disability talent pool, and that's where the training comes in, and we can really help you not only through the training, but also going through the website, which is this discoverability.network. You will see that at the end of the slide deck. I'll say that again, discoverability.network. And so we put this together for businesses, actually. We came together about 3 or 4 years ago with about 6 or 7 other business associations because we were doing training on the AODA, and we were dispelling myths for businesses so that they understood what was required and what was not required. Because what we heard from a lot of our businesses was, there's a whole bunch of people knocking on our door or calling us and saying, I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to spend money on this in relation to the AODA. So what we thought might be really good is develop a training package around that, so business clearly understood what was required and what was not required. And I'll tell you, before we all went into this virtual world of ours, we probably did close to 350 training sessions across the province on the AODA, live training sessions, all set up through local chambers. So very well received. And so that was the reason why we created the Discoverability Network. When we were doing that training on the AODA, we quickly came to realize the talent was a big issue, a really big issue for our companies out there. So, where do you get talent? You get it in your community. How do you get the talent? How do you access different talent pools that maybe you're not currently accessing? And that's where the Discoverability Network came in, because approximately 20% of people in our province and across the country have self-reported they have some form of a disability. So that's a lot of talent, a lot of very skilled people. And if you're not tapping into that talent, that's what the Discoverability Network was all about, is to help businesses do that. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so again, I talked about the 20%. I think that's a really good number to understand. I think in Ontario, that comes out to something like, 1.3 or 1.4 million people in the province. You can also see some of the facts there. And so there's facts and there's myths. I talked about the myths around the AODA. There's also myths around hiring persons with disabilities. So one of the things that we try to do with this program is we try to dispel some of those myths and talk about the facts. So as you can see there, 77% of small business who've hired persons with disabilities, they say they're very pleased. They're happy. They meet the expectations of the employer. So when I take a look at that percentage, and I think of just any demographic in our organizations, if I could say that about 77% of all my staff, they all meet, the expectations of the employer, I'd be a pretty happy camper. So, that's just to show that, hiring from this demographic is something that will help enrich your workplace and help create additional productivity for you in the workplace. You can see the productivity down there. SME, and this is all research, by the way. This is not just us that made this up. This is like research papers that have been written in a number of jurisdictions, including Canada. SMEs, are happy with the productivity of persons with disabilities. Costs, they're also, not huge costs when it comes to accommodation. This is one of the myths, by the way. One of the myths is that, accommodation is really, really hard. Accommodation costs an awful lot of money. So it might be problematic for me because I'm a small business. Well, this is what the stats show. 60% of accommodations cost absolutely nothing.
And Louis, if I can interject there,
Sure.
That's of people who request accommodations.
Yes.
A lot of people with disabilities never ask for an accommodation. So of the people that request, 60% cost nothing.
Yeah, so that's an even lower number in terms of a cost on the organization. And then you can see that 90% of accommodations, their single one-time cost is less than $500. So when you think about, it's about $420 to onboard any employee into an organization. The costs are very much in line. I'm not going to say to you that you're not going to run across some accommodation costs that are going to be higher than $500. There's no question about that. That will happen from time to time, but that's what the average stats show in there. The other thing that you see there is capacity. The capacity of a small business to tap into a talent pool that they normally don't tap into sometimes can be a bit challenging, simply because small businesses don't have those HR departments. So when we put this together, we really have the small business person in mind, because, as you folks know, president is doing, or the owner is doing 17 things, just trying to keep the lights on, keep the payroll going, bringing in the sales. So this is why, another reason when we put the Discoverability Network together, we try to provide that capacity externally to that small business person, so that they could access the talent pool. That's why, when you get a chance, go to discoverability.network. You'll see all kinds of supports on that network that can help you. You can just take the templates and use them. So what are some of the key benefits from hiring from this demographic? You can see this is all about dispelling myths. It's all about dispelling myths. Retention, really good retention rates when you hire from the demographic. Productivity, good productivity rates. Attendance, I hear this a lot, but perhaps, they're not going to come to work as often. Attendance, as you can see the stat there, really good attendance rates. When it comes to health and safety, I don't know if you can see the stat, because I see my pictures in the way.
98%.
You can see that stat, but it's over 90%, when it comes to health and safety, in terms of, fewer workplace accidents. So those are some of the myths that are out there that are all dispelled by research. This is absolute research. And I can just speak a little bit about retention. Okay, maybe if we just go back for a bit.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna call on a story. I used to present with a fellow, Mark Wafer. Some of you may know Mark. He's a champion of hiring persons with disabilities. He used to own about 6 or 7 Tim Hortons, and he's out there now. He's a huge advocate on this. He no longer owns the Tim Hortons, but years ago, he hired an individual in a Tim Hortons with a disability. And I just want to tell the story that he told. At some presentations that we used to do together. He hired this individual as his very first individual from the demographic. And this is a really capable young man, really dedicated, really liked his job, and Christmas time came around, and, at Christmas time, Tim Hortons shut down that day. So when the individual came back to work, they were talking in the workplace, and he was saying, gee, I had a good time at Christmas. Do you want to see some pictures of my Christmas dinner? And so, he showed his pictures, and there's some pictures of him at Christmas dinner with his Tim Hortons uniform on. Now, you can't get better dedication than that, I got to tell you. And that's why the retention rates are so high, because, individuals with a disability, if they get an opportunity, and there's a great work environment, then they tend to stay. And if you're in a service industry like Tim Hortons, and I used to own a restaurant at one time, by the way, I got to tell you, my staff turned over roughly 100%, in about 4 or 5 months every year. I was training new people constantly. And that's a huge burden and a huge cost on a business. Another good reason to hire from this demographic. Next slide, AODA. Okay, so this is the part of the presentation where I'll talk a little bit about the AODA. I won't get into the nitty-gritty because it'll take way too long, but just to give you a brief overview, some of this information you may already know. Really, the goal of the Act was by 2025 and a fully accessible Ontario. There's 5 key standards there. The Act itself and the regulations don't tell you what to do in terms of specific issues in the workplace that may come up, but they do set out the rules that you must follow, okay, to prevent and remove barriers for persons with disabilities in your workplace. And who does that apply to? Pretty much every organization in the province. As long as you have at least 1 employee, then this applies to you, okay? So what are the standards? You can see there's some general requirements. The customer service standard, really, you should be very familiar with this. It was the very first standard that was enacted, and because these have all been rolled out in sequential order, they didn't all come together all at once. And like I said, there was a lot of supports around this. Really, it's all about how do you treat customers? How do you treat a customer that comes into your workplace if they have a disability in a way that they can access the goods and services that you're providing in a way that other demographics in your community can access those goods and services. It's all about providing that good, solid customer service. And we know as business people, That's what it's all about, right? We want to provide good customer service to everybody that comes into our workplaces and our places of businesses, because that's what makes our company prosper. So this is all about providing that good customer service so that we're all very, very familiar with to persons with disabilities. Information and communication is all about how we share and convey information. It's all about making sure that we share information and aware that it can be received and understood, and that we can also receive and understand communication coming back at us as employers. There's the employment standard, which is a real big one. This is a big part of the legislation. It really speaks to the whole gambit of recruiting, hiring, training, and accommodating persons in your place of work that have some form of a disability. Transportation relates to taxi services and municipally run or government run transportation systems. So that's not something that applies to most businesses that usually are on these presentations. And the design of public spaces is just that. It relates to spaces that are accessed by the public. It also relates to countertops and some self-service counters that there's a slide later that I'll speak a little more about that. So this slide really speaks to barriers. What are those barriers in our communities, in our workplaces? Clearly, it's sharing information can be one. The lack of technology can be another. Maybe some of our organizational policies and practices. Clearly, architectural could be an issue there, as you see from the photograph. Really, the one though that we find is most prevalent is attitudes. And attitudes are related to lack of awareness. No one wakes up in the morning and says, gee, I think I'm going to create a barrier for somebody. I don't believe that happens in Ontario. We have a great civil society here. We all help each other, the best we can on a regular basis. So really, it's creating awareness. I know myself, when I don't know something, I tend to make it up in my head. And when I make it up, believe me, I get it wrong. So creating that awareness, education, that's what this is all about, what this initiative is about. I see Lisa's flipped it to the customer service standard. Again, I'll just speak a little more about that now because the slide is up. It really, really speaks to the whole area of how do we treat customers when they come into our workplace. How do we treat service animals? How do we treat support persons? What do we do if there's a temporary disruption of service? It really does speak to training staff so they understand various types of disabilities and how to communicate with folks from that demographic. But also there's an area there in the legislation that says that we should invite customer feedback, which we do for all our, all demographics that we deal with. It's really good for business to understand how our customers relate to the services that we're providing them. And it also talks about communication formats. Just one that I'll speak to. Service animals, as you folks know, they can go anywhere in the workplace unless it's prohibited by another piece of legislation, such as, a health act. I'll give you an example. If a person with a service animal comes into a restaurant, certainly the service animal should be allowed to come in. However, if that individual for some reason needs to be in the kitchen, and that service animal, he wants to have that service animal or she wants to have that service animal accompany them into the kitchen, that's not possible simply because there's another piece of legislation that says that, you can't have animals in place where food is being prepped. So that's an important thing to know. So how would you deal with that? This is the question. How would you deal with something like that where, you're trying to be accommodating, yet there's another piece of legislation that prevents that accommodation from happening? So what you would do is you would talk to the individual, you would put the service animal in a safe place. If the individual, let's say they were a health inspector and they need to take a swab of your kitchen, you'd escort them in. How can I help you? You escort them back into your kitchen to take their swabs, and then you reunite them with the service animal. So that's just a quick example of what you would do when you're faced with something that you're unsure of. Really, it's how may I help you? And the other thing that we say, it's ATP. ATP is the acronym for Ask the Person. If you ask the person, you always come to some kind of compromise accommodation that allows the individual to access the services that they need, but also allows the business to make sure that they're providing that service in a way that makes sense for them. Next slide, information and communications. This really does speak to how we share and convey information. The one thing I like to point out on this one here is have regard for color contrast. Color contrast is extremely important. You know, if you're trying to convey something, whether you're developing a flyer, an e-flyer, whether you're putting up some kind of a billboard, whether you're using those parking lot advertising trailers, you know, where you advertise your business and what you have to offer to your community, make sure that the colors don't bleed into each other, blend into each other. I've seen many of these things in different communities where, you know, the background might be bright green and the lettering they're using is bright orange. Believe me, people can't see that. I've actually stopped my car thinking it's just me, and I pulled over to try and read some of these, you know, parking lot signs. And so whatever that business was paying for that advertising, it certainly wasn't working. So have regard for that color contrast, and when you're preparing your marketing material. Same thing on your website. When you're developing your website and you're trying to figure out, you know, some great colors to use, you know, have regard for these colors that might bleed into each other, because they're hard for people to see them. The other thing you could do is take a look at, you know, and this is where I'm going to ask Lisa to jump in, because there are all kinds of great technology out there that can help with communication and sharing that information. And what I find, and I was the same until I met Lisa, I didn't even realize that my computer with my Microsoft suite of Offices, if that's what it's called, Lisa, because I'm not a techie person, already has all kinds of embedded products in it that are absolutely free. So maybe I'll just turn that over to Lisa now, just to give you a bit of what, you know, her understanding is of what's in your Microsoft suite of services.
Yes, so when we produce documents, as Louis said, color contrast is one thing. What types of fonts and the size of fonts are another. But there's also built-in tools. So companies like Microsoft have seen this as such a important piece that people are asking for, that they've actually embedded some of the accessibility features right into the documents. So when we're working with Word or PowerPoint, there's actually a lot of tools that we can use if we use inbuilt structures on how to create accessible documents. And particularly if our documents are going to be shared over the website, which you're going to see the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0. So we want all our documents that we share to be able to be read by people using assistive devices. So we do give some introductory training on that as well. But information and communications, the other thing I think that's really something that I encourage people to do is make it clear, simple and clear. We have a lot of people who different education levels, different ability with language, not just disability. So, you know, it's worthwhile communicating in a clear, concise manner that is legible, which is what Louis was speaking about with color contrast and what I was mentioning in terms of font sizes.
Thanks, Lisa. The other thing you'll note on that other slide is if you have a company that has more than 50 employees, as of January 1st, you have to comply with WCAG level 2A for your website. Okay, so that's something you should be aware of. Also, there is a reporting requirement. So if you have 20 or more employees, you must report, make a report to the province through the website by June 30th of this year. And so when you sign on, it's a fairly simple reporting requirement. You sign on, you know, you put in your company details and your own information. And then there's usually a series of about 4 or 5 questions that they ask. And probably one of the questions that they may ask this year is whether your website is compliant, because that is the new standard for companies with 50 or more employees. Okay, so the next slide here speaks to the employment standard. As you can see, there's some requirements for companies from 1 to 49, and then there's some higher standards there for employees with 50 plus. Really, the only difference is codification. You need to have things written down. You need to have policies, you know, that you can actually show if someone comes into your workplace and you have 50 or more, and someone says, well, okay, well, show me your workplace information policy. Show me your you know, talent and performance management policies. You really need to have those things in place. Show me about your recruiting and hiring policies. Under 50, you still need to have all these things in place. It's just they don't need to be codified. Our advice to any company is codify everything, write everything down, because you don't want to get into some kind of discussion where you say, well, this is my practice, and someone says, well, no, it's not. It's really important that you do write everything down. And for those folks that don't have a policy gene, and I'm one of them, I don't have a policy gene. I don't write good policy. So what we've done is we actually have developed for businesses templates on our website. Okay, you can go there, whether it's customer service standard you're looking at, whether you're looking at the entire employment standard, they're all there. You can actually read the policies that we've developed or other organizations have actually developed, because we've not only curated our own content, but we've curated content from organizations from across the province that have put some really nice documents in place. And what you can do is you can just read the information, take the template, take the document, put your company name on it. And if it makes all the sense for you, you don't need to change anything if you don't want to. And then train your staff. That's what's really important. It's that staff training to make sure that when you have those policies in place, people are actually following them, and make sure there's some follow-up from yourself or your management team, just to make sure that the policies are being implemented properly in the workplace. Okay. So accessible recruiting, that's all part of the employment standard. It begins right from the time when you start to think about, I need to hire someone. So right from that very beginning, you say, gee, I need to hire an extra person because I need more, my productivity, I need to increase my productivity because I have greater sales, or someone has left. Right away, you should be thinking about accessible recruiting. So what does that mean? It means that when you're looking at the job ad, make sure that your job ad, take a good look at it, because if you're like me or other people that I've talked to, we tend to go into our drawer these days. It's the electronic filing cabinet that we have, and we pull up a job ad that maybe we've used before, and then we kind of look at it and say, yeah, we changed the dates, and we push it out there. Problem is, many times is, and even when I talk to HR folks, and they tend to agree that even HR folks from time to time will be using the ad from before. The problem is, could be an ad that's 10 years old, that's never really been updated, and everyone just keeps using it. So what you end up doing, if you don't do that, if you don't take a look at the ad, you're probably asking for a lot of requirements and qualifications that might not even be necessary for the job that you're hiring, because it's changed. So we just encourage people, take a look at the job ad. Make sure that at the bottom of that ad, you talk about that you're an inclusive employer, and that you will accommodate individuals throughout the entire recruiting process. And that's important. That's a requirement of the regulation. And if you're asked for an accommodation during the recruiting process, you have to take a look at the request and accommodate that individual for that interview in the recruiting process. That's important. The other thing that you should do is think about, when you're setting up your interview. Now these days, it's a little easier because interviews seem to be mostly virtual. They can be easier in some respect, but they could be harder in other respects, because then you have to be careful that how you're structuring that virtual interview, the individuals with a sight impairment, can use some of the technology that they're using to access and read the information that you're providing, through the computer screen. So, going back to in-person interviews, just take a look at where you're holding the interview. Is it on the main floor in case and is there an elevator in the building? If you're not on the main floor, is the entranceway accessible? When you're thinking of questions to answer or to ask, how do you ask those questions, maybe in multiple formats if you're asked? So start thinking about that. Do I need to provide someone extra time, for instance, because maybe I've scheduled a half-hour interview. They may come and say, can I really have 45 minutes because of, I have a disability. Now, they're not going to tell you what their disability is, nor do we have any right to ask what the disability is. But we certainly, in the discussion, find out what their needs are and how can we accommodate their needs through that whole recruitment process. As you can see on the slide, this is a whole webinar on its own, okay, this whole employment standard. So I'm just scratching the surface on this one. So I'll go to the next slide, and maybe then I'll pause it, because I think if the next slide that comes up is accommodation. I usually pause here because usually there's questions on accommodation. Another requirement of the employment standard is that we must be accommodating employers. It's as simple as that. So what does that mean? That means that individuals with a disability can come and request for accommodation. And what are we obligated to do as an employer? We need to create an accommodation plan for them. And so there's a whole process there of how to develop an accommodation plan that you'll see on another slide. There's a step-by-step. The legislation itself doesn't tell you how to accommodate in every circumstance, because that's impossible, but it does set out the process that you need to follow. If once you follow the process and you get right to the end and you find that you can't accommodate, because it happens from time to time, just that accommodation doesn't work for the company. It just doesn't work. What we advise is please seek some outside counsel, because you don't want to get embroiled in a situation where you've denied an accommodation and you really haven't explored all the possible ramification and legal options for you before you turn down that accommodation. So follow the process and see if you can't arrive at an accommodation. That's usually the case, but from time to time, it doesn't happen. I can give you some examples of accommodations these are real live examples that I've used in the past and I've seen from companies because they've related the information to me. So there was an individual, really good welder, strong welder, one of the top welders at a fairly large company that did a lot of welding for international companies as well. And what they noticed was that productivity started going way down and they didn't know why. So, they thought, gee, this is a problem. I'll name the person Fred. I can't remember the name. So, what's wrong with Fred? And they didn't know what was going on. And, someone said, gee, we should have Fred in here and really find out what the heck's going on, more from a performance management issue. And someone said, gee, why don't we just talk to Fred? Why don't we find out what's happening there? So they called Fred in and Fred said, listen, I have this problem. I hurt my back outside of the workplace. I just don't have that mobility. I'm in a lot of pain. So I can't do the kind of welding that I used to do before. So what they decided to do was to explore further what they could do for Fred, because he was one of their top welders. And what they did is they brought in a special chair that cost them about $460 odd, if I remember the amount, definitely under 500. They brought the chair in, and Fred then, with this special chair, became one of their top welders again. So really good news story of how accommodation really helped the company maintain productivity. Really, really good news story. There is a side to the story that's not so good, though. I'll tell you the side that's not so good. The side that's not so good is that even though the company was an accommodating company and they were willing to accommodate their staff, they hadn't trained staff enough about it. They hadn't given that information out, or created that awareness in the company that Fred was comfortable coming to someone and saying, listen, I hurt my back, I need help. So that's why it's so important when you develop these plans that you share that information, create the awareness so that people are coming to you when they need, because it'll help you as an organization and it will also help that individual. Accommodation didn't just start happening when this legislation came into place. Yeah. Businesses have been accommodating for years and years and years. You can see I'm not a very young guy anymore. So, even in the 70s and 80s in organizations that I worked in, we accommodated staff. The first time anyone came to a manager and said, listen, I think tomorrow, can I come in at 10 o'clock instead of 9? Because I have to do something with my children at school. That's an accommodation. So employers have been doing this for years. Why? Because it's good for business. It's absolutely good for business. So at this point here, Lisa, maybe we can flip it to the next slide and I'll pause for any questions. If there's any questions about accommodation.
And I'll just make 2 points about the accommodation. I think you just covered it in such great detail, Louis. So number one, if you don't think you're already great at providing accommodations, 95% of accommodations provided in the workplace have nothing to do with disability. So guaranteed, it's either around family or personal issues or religion. So you are already, great at accommodations. And the second thing is, I like to think of accommodations, they're not an extra. They're simply a way of allowing your staff to be more productive. And who wouldn't want a productivity enhancement? Like, it's a tool. So I think if we think of accommodations in that way, it takes some of the fear out of it. Now, I don't see any questions, but does anybody want to unmute, ask a question, or do we have anybody who's entered anything in the chat box? I'll ask a question then. Louis, do you know what the #1 accommodation in Canada is related to?
Why do you ask me a question that I can't answer?
Okay,
So if you know the answer, you should answer that question.
I do know the answer, Louis. So the #1 accommodation in Canada is for workstations, flexible workstations, right? So that could be an ergonomic workstation, it could be an ergonomic keypad, it could be for a chair. It's one of the top 3. So the other ones are ergonomic keyboard is definitely up there. I think it's 3. Ergonomic workstation is 1, and #2 is flexibility. So maybe some flexibility in terms of what hours somebody works. Maybe they start a half hour later, work half hour later. Maybe they work through their lunch. Maybe it's like, you know, you have more frequent breaks, but they're shorter than the 15-minute coffee break you traditionally get. So they're not hugely expensive and pretty easy to implement.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisa, for bailing me out of that really tough question. So on the screen now, you will see the process to follow. So, you know, I said earlier, it doesn't say, the legislation doesn't say how to accommodate. It says, how do you get to the accommodation decision? And this is what you do. The key here is the participation of the individual. I said earlier, ATP, ask the person. You can't ask them about their disability, but you certainly can ask about what are their needs in terms of help in the workplace through the accommodation. Really, really important. Ask the individual. You know, if you need some additional information, outside information, with the individual's permission, you can certainly get that through a medical, request or to some other expert, that you can get that additional information in terms of finding out exactly what the individual can and can't do in terms of the workplace. So, you know, if you're in a place where, you know, there's some lifting to be done, as an example, you know, you can actually determine how much can the person lift, if at all, or, you know, what other things can they do when you're looking at accommodation that will still help the company. Accommodation is not a lowering of the standards. I think I need to stress this. It's not a lowering of the standards. It's really trying to match what the individual's capacities are with the needs of with the needs of the employer. And don't we try and do that all the time with any staff member that we have? What we want to do is ensure that we create an environment that is as productive as possible for anyone. All what this legislation does, it speaks to the demographic, it speaks to persons with disabilities. Lisa, I see you want to jump in here.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would stress on this is, I know it looks like a lot of steps. It really isn't. It's kind of, you know, common sense. When we ask the medical professional, we're not going to ever ask what the diagnosis is. We're going to ask about the functional requirements, which you talked about, Louis. So what can they lift? What can they not lift? What can they do? What can they not do? The other thing that I think is really, really important about this is, how are you going to protect the privacy? Because it is up to you to keep that information confidential and private. So, you know, who's going to have access to it? Where are you going to store it? Again, it doesn't have to be overly complicated, but you do need to consider. And I know, Louis, I get a lot of questions when I do this training about what happens if an individual requests an accommodation, you provide it, but then other employees start complaining because it looks like special treatment.
And this is where, you know, the training in advance for all employees is extremely important. This is where everyone should understand that you're, you know, that you're an accommodating employer, you're an inclusive employer. And so it'll really diminish those kinds of things happening in your workplace. But if you don't train people, and out of the blue, you know, I'm now getting some kind of special treatment that someone views what you've done for me, because now I have this special desk that maybe, you know, rises and falls with electronic buttons. You know, you could get that. But, you know, once you do the training and make sure you keep the training up on a regular basis, people won't even ask, you know, why does Louis have this? Because they'll come to understand it's probably part of some form of accommodation that the employer has entered into with that employee. And again, you can't tell anybody. It's a private process. You have to maintain confidentiality. So if you're asked, you know, why does Louis have the desk? you can say, maybe you should talk to Louis about it, or maybe, at the end of the day, it's just something that we worked out as part of our efforts to help people in the workplace. But you really can't get into the discussion as to why Louis has that special desk. Okay. So again, this slide just again speaks to accessibility and accommodation. I talked about the really essential line on this slide already, and that's that the essential duties of the job still need to be performed. It does not mean that standards are lowered. That's key, and that's not, and that's part of the legislation. Legislation doesn't say lower your standards. It doesn't say that they can't perform essential duties. It just means that you need to provide an accommodation that allows them to do that. That's really what it comes down to. It's matching their abilities with the needs of the organization. Okay. This is another requirement under the legislation, workplace emergency response. This is extremely important. It's so that everyone in your workplace can be safe in the event of emergency, and they could leave the workplace just like any other person in the workplace that may not have a disability. And so how do you develop one of these responses? You can see on the slide deck there, 4 simple questions. How will people know that there is an emergency? How will they know where to go? Is the way out accessible, and what supports are needed? If when you're developing these plans with someone that requires them, if you ask yourself these 4 questions, you will develop a plan that is good for the organization and good for the individual as well. And it is a requirement. So if you become aware of someone in the workplace that has a disability that requires a workplace emergency response, we are obligated as employers to develop one. Okay, again, when you develop these things, confidential, cannot be shared. There is some instances, however, where you may have some other staff be support staff for an individual in the event of an emergency. And with the permission of the individual that requires that plan, you can share the plan with those support people. I can give you a quick example. Not all buildings have fire alarms that have both audio and visual alarms. So what could happen is someone that is deaf, the alarm could go off. If it's just an audio, they wouldn't know that there's an emergency there. So clearly, you need to have a support person notify that individual, let them know that there is an emergency so that they can leave the building just like everybody else. That's just a quick, simple example of developing an emergency response plan. The other one is return to work process. I won't dwell on this a lot other than to say again, this is something employers have been doing for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Okay. And why? Because it's good for business. It's not just good for the individual, it's good for business. Because if you work in a place where you have fixed posts or you can't afford to have people off because of the work that you're doing, if someone is off due to a disability, the sooner you bring that individual back, the better it is not only for them, but also you as a business. And that's what this is really all about. It's about having a process and a policy, if you're more than 50 employees, where you can deal with individuals that have a disability, help them return to work in a way that makes sense for them. Again, what can and they can't do, that's how you figure this out. And then you develop that accommodation plan to move them into the workplace sooner rather than later. You've heard of work hardening. That's one of the things that you can do. You can bring them in on a part-time basis initially. You can adjust and modify the work they're doing for a period of time until they can get back to full activities. Accessible spaces and buildings. I'm just looking here at time. Where are we at? Oh, we're getting there. I got to go a little quicker now. So for the AODA, there is a section there for the design of public spaces. What do they deal with? Service counters, waiting areas, outdoor spaces such as parking lots, also picnic areas, marinas. These are all things that are captured under this piece of legislation, and they're quite technical, by the way. It's a quite technical specifications. So when you're putting in a service counter, if that's something that you're doing, if you're an organization, let's say that's managing a trail or developing a brand new trail in your community, please have regard for the specifications in this piece of legislation. It doesn't apply to existing, it applies to new or major overhauls of an existing space. So again, doesn't apply to existing, it applies to new or major overhauls of an existing space. The reason why you see the Ontario Building Code here is because the AODA does not deal with what's dealt with the Ontario Building Code. So, you know, the whole notion of ramps, accessible bathrooms, you know, doors that have, you know, automatic opening devices, not covered in the AODA. So someone comes to you and says, you know, for the AODA, under the AODA, you need to put in an automatic door opener. The answer is no, that's not an AODA requirement. It may be a building code requirement that may apply to you. And the building code was updated, I think, a couple of years ago now, January. And as you know, existing buildings don't need to follow the latest updated building code. However, all new buildings do need to follow the latest updated building code. However, if you're making a renovation to your space, whether you're a tenant or a building owner, you could be captured under the rule of percent renovation. So if you go beyond a certain percent of renovations of your existing space, you then do become captured with the updated building code. Again, when I was a restaurant owner, we bought a place, we went into it, we changed the carpeting. We didn't get captured by the updated building code at that time. However, later on, we turned the whole space into a bar. So we went from a restaurant to a bar. You can appreciate we really gutted the place and started again when we went in and got our building permit. And those are the people that will tell you whether you get captured by the updated code. They clearly said to us, you know, given you're doing a major overhaul of your space, you now do get captured by the updated code. So we had to comply with the updated code. Now there is an interplay between the requirement, you know, to accommodate and provide good customer service with the building code and with the human rights code as well. So even though, you know, the AODA is not going to say to you, you know, you need to put a ramp, you know, so if you're one of these street level businesses and you have a lip, you know, from the sidewalk into your business, and it's difficult for someone in a wheelchair, for instance, to get into your business, the AODA doesn't say, you know, that you need to have a ramp. What could happen to you, and this has happened, if someone files a complaint against you through the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the commission takes up that case, you may receive a judgment against you that says that you need to allow, you know, create some form of ramp so that individual can get into your place of business. And that has actually happened in some communities across the province where storefront operators there was a judgment issued against them a few years back. So it set precedent that if there is a complaint, and that's and they actually had to pay a fine and create some access opportunities for folks with wheelchairs. That's why you see, you know, those little stopgap ramps as you see them, those little yellow ones. They're technically don't meet code, by the way, okay, because a ramp is specific to the height of the lip, you know, that you're trying to solve. And you know, many of our sidewalks just aren't wide enough to allow a ramp to be built. Simply, you know, if you go exactly to specifications. So many business owners are using these stopgap ramps. They put them in place, you know, the person gets access, they provide them good customer service. And then when they leave, some of them pull them up or they pull them up at the end of the day. So that's an alternative. Even though it doesn't meet code, it does solve the problem for you. Okay, next slide, Lisa. Again, this is on our discoverability site, discoverability.network. This is a how-to roadmap. If you're looking to hire from this demographic, you're not sure how to proceed or how to start, this is the A to Z primer for businesses looking to do this. It was written actually by Lisa. This is when I first got to know Lisa years ago. And I will tell you, when she first developed the first draft of this, it was like 20 steps. And I said to Lisa, this doesn't work because, you know, in the business community, we're not going to read a 20-step document. It's not going to happen. So she went back a few times, came back with a 5 or 6 step process, and it seems to be well received. So if you're looking for that information, just go to the roadmap on the Discoverability Network. It has everything you need to know about hiring right from the beginning to the end. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. This is just a slide that speaks to the actual Discoverability Network. When you get there, you'll see a couple of buttons, one for job seekers, one for employers. So you click on the appropriate button and then you get the information you need and the resources you need, whether you're a job seeker or an employer. resources. Like I say, lots of great templates, lots of great videos on there, lots of great business cases that you can read. The hiring roadmap is there, obviously, lots of FAQs. And then if you want to find talent, click there and you can post your job. What's next, Lisa? I think pretty much I'm
That's
done.
it. Yeah,
That's
we're
it.
done.
I am done. What you see here is just, you know, other websites you can go to get that information. So with that, I will stop. And if there's any questions, we are both here happy to help with any questions you may have.
Well, Louis, I think while we're waiting for any questions, I can just remind people that this is part one of a 4-part series of webinars that we're doing on discoverability. So the Milton Chamber has the next one coming up on March the 3rd, which is disclosure and accommodations in the workplace, followed by March 17th, which is drive profitability through an inclusive workforce. And then the final of the 4 series is on March 24th. Why join the Discoverability Network?
Okay, thanks, Scott. So any questions, Lisa?
No, I think you did a great job covering, you know, most of the details. It seems, I think, you know, more than it is when a lot of it's common sense. You know, I can speak to Louis as an employee. Louis is great at providing accommodations. I don't think it's slowed us down. We have a you know, a great team, and Louis is an inclusive employer as well. So I think he can speak to that from personal experience, as well as, you know, an organization that is committed to this program.
I see there was one question. Can they email us with questions? And the answer is yes. Whether you want to email us through Scott and his team or direct, we're happy to field questions for you if you think of some questions later on.
But not a lawyer.
Yeah, but we're not lawyers. Remember that. We're not going to give you any kind of legal advice. We'll tell you about what's required under the legislation, and then, but you know, don't take it as legal advice, please.
Yes. And in fact, I would say that most situations are not going to go there. I mean, accommodations, pretty common sense. A lot of them, the most common ones, you know, are to do with ergonomics. And as we have an aging workforce, that's increasingly something that we want to be thinking about, whether a person has a disability or not. Flexibility, which we you know, already do as employers. We offer flexibility for our employees
Okay.
Oftentimes. Yeah.
Okay, is that it?
That's it. Well, I want to
We
thank
covered everything. Yeah.
thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Louis, for a great presentation. We appreciate it. And,
Thank you, Scott, for having us, and thank everyone for being with us. Have a good day, folks.
Thanks. We'll see you on the next webinar.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.